Hello, and welcome to the final questions in the sixth fetter. These questions are the ones that we would like for you to write down in a notebook and reflect on. It's not questions that you can just hear and while you're doing other stuff. It's really, really helpful if you really sit down and ponder and reflect on the questions. So they're useful if you have done the sixth fetter. They're also useful if you are way further in all the fetters and you have had a process over an extended period and you would just like to get a bit back to that sensation of a subject-object, and you would like to have a few pointers on how you can work with them, and what is important to look into to work more with the sixth fetter. So the first question is, how do you know if you are sensing or assuming? And that's a really good question. It's part of how we work with the sixth fetter. It's really noticing what you are sensing with your five senses, what you are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, what you're actually sensing, and what you assume that you're sensing. So we have done a lot of exercises with you here in the sixth fetter where we look into that. Where we, for example, the exercise with the cone, where you sit and look at the cone, or you sit and look at an object and really notice how the first time you start to look at it, you don't really see it, you just recognize it. Just like when you're reading, you don't really read every single word, you just recognize it. And the sixth fetter is all about that. It's all about really becoming aware of what is happening in your direct experience, in your senses, in the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And what are you assuming about it? So what do you think you see? Or what do you think you hear? What do you think you smell, taste, and touch? And what do you actually see, hear, smell, taste, touch? And the interesting part is that even though you really sit with that question, whatever you are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, very, very quickly a thought is attached to it. And the moment you attach a thought to what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, it changes. You're no longer seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. You're thinking about what you see, hear, smell, taste, touch. And as we talked about multiple times in the lower fetters, that the moment a thought is attached, the next thought is built on that post-it from the thought. So it's no longer about what is actually here. It's only about what you think about what you think is here. So the question, how do you know if you're sensing or if you're assuming? It's really a profound one, because you would have to reflect on everything. If you look out the window right now and you look at what is out there, do you see how quickly the mind is attaching a label to that being a house, that being a tree, that being the clouds? Oh, it's a bit rainy today. None of that is what you're actually seeing. That is only what you're thinking about it. Every single label you add to anything you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, it's not about what is actually there. It's what you think about it. So if you haven't done those exercises, I can warmly recommend you to do that. It's really interesting to be in the world where you focus on your direct experience. You focus on what you see, hear, smell, taste, touch. And you become aware of how quickly you minimize that experience into what you think you're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And the part is that the moment we attach a thought to it, we have limited the experience. Because now you're in your mind. And the mind can only refer to what it already knows. Which means that whatever was just about to psychedelically expand and become into surreal experiences, you just took a step away from that by adding a label. It's also why a lot of people that have done drugs or have done any kind of psychedelic, or had any kind of psychedelic experiences, that a lot of them have had that experience of the subject-object expanding, merging into something else or something more. And it's kind of like striving to get that back. And obviously you can experience that with psychedelics, but what that does is altering the brain. It's much more fun to do that in your everyday life. So just by sitting and looking out the window, you can start to have those experiences. If you completely detach any thought you have about your sensory experiences, and you do not minimize the experience in any way with a thought, but you just allow it to expand and to become what it wants to become, or for you to actually notice what is there, then you start to have those psychedelic experiences, even though you're not affected in any way by any kind of drugs. It's just life. The next question is, how has your experience of subjects' aliveness and interconnectedness changed? And obviously it's very much in line with the question I just asked you. The moment you're not attaching anything to your direct experience, and you are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, you allow things to be different than what you assume them to be, which means that they become alive. They start to morph and change into something you did not expect. Because how could you possibly expect something that you never experienced before? And that's the advantage with detaching any kind of assumptions. You allow it to become alive in a way that you have not experienced before. And that creates a interconnectedness, because you start to see that the tree that is outside your window, it's not separated in any way from the soil or the sun. The tree is only there and existing because of the soil and the rain and the sun. And the experience of that tree is happening with your senses. And you're only here because of so many factors that has happened. So it creates an interconnectedness, an experience of interconnectedness that is way beyond anything that I can sit now and add words to, because when I do that, I limit your experience. So the question is, when you were working with the sixth fetter, did you experience that interconnectedness, that aliveness that is happening, that all your senses are a part of? We're not isolated in any way to anything that is happening around us. Just like a sound that is happening in itself, what is making that sound is not creating a sound. The sound is created in your brain by your ears. And that creates an interconnectedness with the experience that you only become aware of when you work with the sixth fetter of the subject and object. So have you had those experiences? Have you made those connections? And by making connections, I obviously don't mean that you sit down and think about it and create connections like that. I obviously mean that the connections are happening without a mind experiencing it. Have you let go of it and just allowed things to unfold and to feel into that aliveness and that interconnectedness that is with everything? It's only when we are in a distance to what is actually happening that we can live our life disconnected from everything, from the earth and all the animals and all other peoples. It's only when we disconnect that we can create then them and I, create cliques and tribes and political parties. All of that dissolves when you work with the sixth fetter. So if you've done the work in all the fetters up until this point, you also know that there's no striving for anything or avoidance of anything else. Those hooks have been detached as well, which means that there's just an experience of flow, of everything changing all the time, as if it was a kaleidoscope that you slowly turn on, and the entire picture is different every time you look and smell and taste and touch. The third question: how do you feel the change in visual perception relate to feelings of being interconnected and the loss of subjectivity? And obviously this is very similar to the question we just had, but this one is really focusing on the visual sense. So when you sit and look at something, have you experienced how boundaries are being dissolved? If you do not attach any thought into what it is you're seeing. So the label of what you're looking at is removed. The moment you do that, have you experienced how things change before your eyes? And obviously that is because you're no longer limiting any object to be something certain. You're no longer limiting a tree to be in a certain way. The branch you're sitting and looking at is no longer a branch. It's no longer connected or needs to be connected to a tree to be a branch, because you have detached the label of branch. It's just an experience of darkness and lightness, and the more you sit and look at it, the more it morphs and becomes something else than what you just looked at. The visual field is an amazing sense to work with when we're working with the sixth fetter, because there's so many things that is anchoring us into an I and into a body and into a subject here and an object there. If you sit with your eyes closed and you focus on your hearing, the moment you open your eyes, everything you thought you heard is changing into something that your visual field says that it is. So you might have heard a sound, and the moment you open your eyes, you saw it was a car. And then the sound of the car changes and suddenly become a car sound. Where before the visual sense was attached to it, it was just a sound. It had no start and no end. There was no beginning and end to the sound. It was just a sound that was one with the silence before and after. But the moment you open your eyes, it kind of becomes a thing. And that's why it's particularly interesting to work with the visual sense when we work with the sixth fetter. And the more you sit and look at a thing, you experience what Todd talked about in the 10 pointers, that when you hear a word like apple, 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 the more you sit and repeat it, the more it changes from being an apple into being a weird sound that is almost unrecognizable to anything. And you start to question, is that how it's said? Is that how it is? Or am I pronouncing it wrong? And the same thing you can do with your visual field. It takes a bit of practice, but by just sitting and looking at one thing, you start to see how the boundaries are morphing and changing, and the thing itself becomes something else. It's something undescribable, something that you can't limit with a label on it. It's not simply not doing the thing justice anymore to add a label to it. It's like if you have a pet, like let's say you have a dog named Fido. Just saying that you have a dog named Fido is way too limiting to what that animal actually means to you. The label is not describing the daily experience you have with that being. And it's like that with everything. So if you just focus on the seeing sense, whatever label you're bringing to anything you look at is limiting the experience. And that's why the visual sense is particularly interesting to work with the sixth fetter. And that is kind of leading me into the next question. How has your experience of two-dimensional vision, depth, and aurus changed? And what we want for you to be curious about is exactly what we just talked about. It's when you are detaching all labels, you allow things to be as they are. And when we talk about two-dimension vision, a lot of people have that as the goalpost for the sixth fetter, which is just creating something out of nothing. You know, it's just creating an I that can have an experience that is cooler than if you didn't have that experience. I mean, all fetters are represented in that striving. The visual field is two-dimensional. You might look at me sitting here on the screen right now and seeing a depth. But that is created by the mind. It is a computer screen or a phone you're sitting and looking at. The screen is flat. There's nothing more there. So you can pause the video and sit and look at it and look how what seemingly looks like depth is just darkness. It's a darker color that gives the brain the indication of a depth being there. It's easiest to do that with something flat, like a painting or a photo, a mirror reflection. And when you have done that a few times, and you've seen that there is no depth, there's just a darkness in the coloration that makes the brain think that there's depth, then start to look at things that are in front of you, where it seemingly looks like something bigger is closer to you, something smaller is further away from you. If you start to look at it like that it's not closer or further away, it's bigger or smaller, then you start to get the look that artists, painters, that they have. They can only draw it in a way so it looks like depth on a painting, because they really see how it looks. It's fascinating to watch like videos of Bob Ross, for example, or any other painter that is painting, and just with dabbing a brush on a canvas, suddenly you get a depth in a painting. You can do that right now by sitting and looking at something. That whatever you look at, it is two-dimensional. It's the brain that is creating a sense of a depth. The other question is about auras, and I know that in the spiritual world it becomes like a thing, like it's extra attractable and extra, it's extra attractive if you can see auras, and it's something that to strive for, to be able to. But again, that is just a full representation of all the feathers, of all the different ways we can identify. You don't need to strive for that. You already see it. If you detach any limitation in your visual field, it is a practice like anything else. Because you need to detach the assumptions that the mind is doing on its own. So by sitting and practicing to see things as they really are, they start to morph and become different. And that's also when you start to see different colors. Things are not the color that you think it has. For example, if you look at a leaf, it might look just green. But when you detach the assumption of how a leaf looks, and you really look at it, you start to see all the colors are represented in that leaf. You start to see like an energy field. I don't want to limit it by calling it something that we might not know that it actually is, but you start to see colors around the outer boundary. So the outer boundary is not the outer boundary anymore. And that is what is really interesting to play with. And if you haven't done those exercises yet, I can warmly recommend you to do them, because it's those exercises that are helping you to really become aware of that subject-object delusion that we have, that we call the sixth fetter. The next question is one of my favorite ones. What is your understanding of the quote, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form"? Now, before I tell you how I understand that quote, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," I would like for you to maybe pause the video and sit and look at something and keep repeating, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." And close your eyes and then hear all the sounds around you and keep repeating, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." And then start to notice what happens, because it's really pointing to something very, very important. So let's split it up. When we say form is emptiness, we're not talking about nothingness. We're not saying that there is no tree, there is no earth, there is no ocean, there is no universe, there is no nothing. The form is emptiness, emptiness is form. It's not talking about that there's nothing. It's not talking about nihilism in any way. It's saying that form is emptiness. It's reminding us of that anything is empty of a self. It doesn't have an inherent nature on its own. So form is emptiness. The plant is not a plant. Like I said a million times during all the lessons in the curriculum. Whatever label you attach to it, it's just a label. It's not the real deal. It's not the real thing. So look out your window. Form is emptiness. Whatever you say, you see. That's a tree, that's a cloud, that's a house, that's a dog, that's a car. It's not, though. That is a label you're attaching to it. The individual components of a car or a table is like we also talked about. When does it stop being a car? How many things can you remove until it's not a car anymore? And then you have all the individual parts lying out on the ground. Is that a car? It's not. It's individual components. So form is empty of an inherent self, of an inherent nature, of anything that you can limit it to be within your understanding. 10th Fetter is reminding us constantly that we do not know. And the other part of it, with emptiness as form, I always felt that the Buddha was talking about E equals mc squared. You know, that an hydrogen atom has less mass than the combined mass of the proton and the electron. We only know the world through our 5 senses. We only know what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch. Whatever thought you attach to it is about a thought. It's not about what it actually is. But whatever the world is, it's so much more than just what you can see, hear, smell, taste, touch. The individual parts become something else. If you look at a flower, the flower is not just a flower. The flower is seed and soil and rain and sunshine. It's so much more. And smelling a flower is a you that started out as egg and sperm, grew into, an appreciation of a scent. So explaining what a flower is impossible. It's so much more than its individual components. So we could just shorten the Heart Sutra, emptiness is form and form is emptiness, into saying that full of everything but empty of self-nature. But as I spoke with Todd about it earlier this morning, and he pointed out that in that dualistic, that doubleness, that negation that is in it, that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. We're reminded that we can't attach anything to either. We can't believe that we know everything just by knowing the one. Form is emptiness. I get that one now. Emptiness is form. Okay, I get that one now. Combined, it reminds us of being humble to whatever we think we know is. It's the 10th fetter again. That we do not know. We're very, very limited in our experience of what is. So to combine this with the 6th fetter, if there is a subject that is experiencing an object, you need to look into the assumed inherent self and inherent nature in the subject and dissolve that. And the same you do with whatever object you look at. You need to dissolve the inherent nature of that object. There's no inherent self in it. You need to look at all the individual parts and let go of all assumptions that you have of that. And in that space, you have the full emptiness. So it's not nothingness at all. It's not nihilism in any way. It's allowing things to be as they are. Next question. How was the most significant shift of the dissolution of subject-object experience? And what we would like for you to reflect on is obviously write down what your experience was. Write down how it shifted, what insight it gave you. And then look at everything you have written down and start to dissolve even that experience. It's also useful for you to share that experience with others. It's super helpful to hear about others' experiences. And that's why I can recommend you to join the Unfettered Awakening on Discord, where we are a huge community now, talking about awakening and sharing our experiences. And if you could share your experience of the most significant shift of the dissolution of subject-object was experienced by you in there, it would be so helpful to so many people. Because you describing your experience is helpful, partly for you to become aware of what actually happened. Become aware of any other types of attachment that is to that experience. But also for other people to experience the shift that you had through your words. The next question. How did you realize that sensory experiences are not truth and cannot be trusted? And we have already touched on that. You can only relate to the world with seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. But even that is a very limiting experience. Whatever you think you see, hear, smell, taste, touch is limited to what you previously have experienced. So you need to detach the assumption of it and allow the experience to be free. So you need to set you free, and you need to set the sensory experiences free to experience what is there in the moment, which is also changing all the time. Impermanence, nothing stays the same. And that really gives you an insight too, that even though the five senses are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, they cannot be trusted, because that is morphing all the time. That is changing all the time. Take a bite of a lemon and see how that experience is changing all the time. They're not 2 seconds of that experience that is the same. If you take a bite of a lemon and you experience the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and the feeling in the body, you will really notice how much impermanence is present all the time. The moment that is here now is not here now. It has already changed. That's how quick it goes. And by limiting ourselves with the seventh fetter, which is the next one we're moving into, with the sense of time, if you even detach that, then you have a bite into a lemon and you have an experience now, and now, and now, and now, and every now is different, because nothing is staying the same. The receptors in your taste buds react differently every single moment. The contraction in your muscles, in your jaw, is changing all the time. The experience of the smell is changing the more you chew on the lemon. The bodily sensation is changing. And you will also notice that there's coming, because of the sensory experiences are so overwhelming by taking a bite of a lemon. The thought is attaching itself to every single experience you have and is trying to make sense of what you're experiencing. And by that, you're limiting the experience. So have you experienced that? That none of the senses can be trusted. It's the only experience you can have of the world. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. But none of them can be trusted. They're constantly changing and constantly becoming something else than it was a moment before. And that leads to the next question. How has your experience of synesthesia changed? And synesthesia is the thing we experience when we no longer limit a seeing to be only the seen, and a sound to be only the heard, and what you smell only to be something that can be experienced with your nose, and tasting and touching the same with that. And that is when you have worked with the sixth fetter and you have experienced how boundaries start to dissolve. You can look at a green color and taste it. We can hear a sound and feel it. That type of synesthesia is the most common one. That you hear music and it evokes feelings. It evokes emotions. So you can start with that. Or you can practice the exercises that we have talked about in the sixth fetter over and over again. And notice how synesthesia is a part of everything. Nothing is limited to the form that we have decided that it has. That is completely arbitrary. It's not actually the form that it has. Anything you see, hear, smell, taste, touch has no boundary within itself like that. That boundary is part of an assumption. So when you let go of the assumption and you allow the sensory experience to be as it is, synesthesia happens. And that is where you start to feel a cloud or smell a sound. That there's no longer any limit to how any of the senses can be experienced. And that leads me to the next question. How has your relationship with animals or other beings or the planet changed? And obviously when you're working with the sixth fetter and you no longer limit your experience to be based on your assumptions, and you no longer experience things having a boundary like you used to think that it had, that activates an aliveness and interconnectedness with everything. You're not separate from any other being or the planet. You're not separate from the oxygen you inhale. You're not separate from the water that you inhale and you exhale. The exhalation you have is becoming rain at some point. You are part of all the stars in the universe. The amount of atoms is constant, no matter if you're here or not. You are a part of it. And that boundary that we experience is dissolved in the sixth fetter. There's no longer anything outside of you. There's no longer a you inside of you. There are more bacteria in your body than there are cells. There are more them than there's you, if you can say it like that. And those bacteria is part of life in a way that you cannot limit it to say that they are you. And the boundaries between that and everything else is absolutely dissolved when you work with sex fetter. So the bacteria that are here, or all the waste products that the bacteria in your body are producing, is becoming part of your immunity, part of your gut flora, part of the maintenance of the meat suit. There's no difference between them and the meat suit. They are the constituents of the meat suit. And there's no difference in those bacteria or those cells and any other cell. That was on a very close-up level. So if you look out the window again, and you see how everything is dissolving its boundaries, and you see how you become it by sitting and looking, or if you go out and hug a tree, you can feel how you cannot differentiate between where your skin ends and the tree starts. Just by, if you place your feet on the floor, you cannot differentiate between where your feet ends and the floor starts. And that dissolving of boundary creates a feeling of interconnectedness and aliveness, that you are part of it. There's no us and them. We are all the same. It makes no sense to have a war. It makes no sense to fight cancer. Cancer is part of the body. How can you fight your body? You will lose that fight. There's a constant exchange happening over the cell membranes that is creating a new experience of everything. And that aliveness and that interconnectedness is happening without a you and without a them. So how has your experience and relationship with animals or other beings or the planet changed? Have you tried to stand in a forest and be the forest? Have you tried to swim in the ocean and be the ocean? And that leads to the next question. How have your experiences or assumptions of personal boundary changed? And obviously, like we talked about in the first lesson, here in the sixth fetter, you need to have strong boundaries for this to happen. If you do not have strong boundaries, go back to the second fetter, work with that, with the toxic starting point. Sort out all the trauma. Connect with your body. Do the different body exercises that we have in the material that is helping you with connecting with your body and letting go of any kind of manifested trauma in the body. The trauma is not you, it's the body that has a memory of an experience that just needs to be experienced. And then you can start to dissolve the boundary. So how has your experience or assumptions about your personal boundaries changed? I hope you understand that I'm not talking about you becoming a doormat. I'm not talking about you being a virtual buffet where people can just take. Have you felt that your boundaries have become much stronger? That the feeling of I am here, I matter, I'm safe, that we talked about in the second fetter. Have they become more alive in you? Do you feel that there are very, very clear boundaries. And yet, any hook that you have into the boundaries have dissolved. So it's no longer that you need to put your foot down or emphasize where a boundary is. It's obvious. It's obvious where the boundary is. And that is where it starts to dissolve. I would like for you to write in the Discord group or in the comment section here below how your experiences and your assumptions of your boundaries have changed. It's really helpful for other people that are either in the phase where they are starting to build their own boundaries or in the phase of dissolving those boundaries. The thing is that when we build the boundaries, it's because there's not a solid sense of a self, and that needs to be sorted before we start to dissolve boundaries. It is work that is needed in order for you to be in the world without any bypassing or any attachment. And when you do exercises in the sixth fetter where you sit and notice things outside of you, for example, the cup exercise where you sit and hold the cup, you feel how the physical boundary, the perception of the physical boundary is changing. So have you also worked with the fifth fetter about putting your foot down, standing up for yourself, defending yourself? Have you detached those assumptions that is no longer needed when there's a clear boundary? It's no longer needed to emphasize with any kind of anger where the boundary is. It's quite clear. It's a very clear experience of no. And there's a very clear experience of yes, which is the body no and the body yes. There's no attachment to any of it. There's nothing that becomes something else by that very clear no. It's just a no. And nothing becomes something else by a yes. It's just a yes. There's no attachment to anything. And a no is just a no. There's nothing more than that. So how has your experience of clear boundaries and personal boundaries changed? And that leads me to the last question. What aspect of your perception of boundaries still needs to be explored further? And this is obviously an never-ending, ongoing exploration full of curiosity to what is happening. What part of your experience of boundaries still have a hook attached into something else? It leads us into the seventh fetter, something out of nothing, form in the formless, where there is nothing and we're creating something out of that. When that happens, there's an exploration of boundaries that needs to happen, that you need to question what the experience of boundaries actually is. No matter if that boundary is experienced in a moment of a now that right now is now a past. Or if there's a boundlessness in its own nature, where there's nothing that is limiting anything to be anything. So this question is the one that we would like for you to keep inquiring about. Go out and sit in a forest, be in nature, sit on a beach, and experience the question of what aspects of your perception of boundaries still needs to be explored further. What are you still assuming boundaries to be or not to be? What are you still assuming the subject object to be or not to be? What are you still limiting your experience about? What boundaries do you still assume is there? And that is what needs your further exploration. Thank you.